Hello, my name is Ash.
And I'm Callie.
And welcome to Paved with Gold, the eating disorder recovery podcast. I would like to acknowledge the traditional landowners on which Callie and I are recording and extend the same respect to the traditional custodians of the lands from which you are all listening. We are back for part 2 of the Minnesota Starvation Study.
Woohoo!
If you have, I don't know how woohoo it's going to be. Depends on how you fared with the last bit. But
I'm like, oh gosh, here we go again.
If you haven't listened to part 1, stop this episode right now and go back to the previous episode. It's going to make a lot more sense.
This will be just gibberish.
We got through a lot in the last episode, and this episode is going to be no different because I can't shut up about this apparently. So if you wouldn't mind, Callie, what do you remember from our last episode?
Okay, a lot, kind of, but also probably not enough. No, okay, what do I remember? No, I remember a researcher within like the health and nutrition kind of industry back within war times, World War II, the 1940s, Ansel Keys, a super sometimes problematic guy, but also sometimes maybe helpful person, nuance, we love it. Basically wanted to conduct a study on the impact of starvation, and the way that he framed himself doing that was for the greater good, so that we can kind of figure out the way that bodies were impacted by starvation and, like, in a sense, fix that. I remember he had his test subjects, and that was a whole process to find those people. They had to be objectively healthy, thin, white men.
Yep.
Average in inverted commas, although we kind of argue that there maybe weren't an average representation of the population. And basically we spoke about the impacts of what this experiment did to them. So it was a year experiment. It went into stages. Stage 1 was 3 months of giving them a really great idea of what might be ahead with a larger meal plan.
The control period,
The control period, yes. And then I remember the next stage was the 6 months. Was it the 6 month stage?
Yep, 6 months.
And that was kind of the semi-starvation stage. Something that really stuck out for me in that stage that you spoke about was the concept where Ansel didn't necessarily want to starve them completely. He was sort of thinking he was giving them a meal plan or a calorie count that they would be able to kind of sustain, like a bit of a base level of human to themselves. But he kind of discovered otherwise. That really stuck out to me. Essentially the impacts that this regime had on these perceivably healthy white men. And
exactly
then
right.
A few of them left, and they got to the end of the experiment, and did we get to the end? Yes, we did.
Yes, we stopped right before the last official stage. So
how did I go?
10 out of 10.
10 out of 10. Yes. Never happens.
So like I mentioned last episode, most of the research I got for this episode was from a book by Todd Tucker called The Great Starvation Experiment, Ansel Keys and the Men Who Starved for Science. You can check that out in the show notes. I highly recommend it in the event that you want to learn more about this. So before we get into part 2, where we will cover the last 2 phases of the experiment, as well as some final roundups, same as last time, big old trigger warning for this episode. It's very much the same as the last one. There will be talk of numbers, weights and calories, one incident of self-harm, and there will be some World War II historical references that I will be talking about as a general historic context, more so than the last episode. So I'm just flagging that there in case that's an issue for anybody. But I'll also give warnings before I mention these topics. But again, we're looking at this study as it was at the time and as the only clinical study we have on the effects of starvation on the human body. We acknowledge its flaws and biases, but we are looking at it as it stands. So as always, if this is going to be a tough one for you, just give it a miss. We will not take it personally, and we'll see you next time. So to pick up where we left off, as you very graciously recapped for us.
Oh, thank you.
The semi-starvation period had just completed on the 28th of July, 1945. 4 men had been expelled from the study, 3 for cheating, quote unquote, and for mental instability. And then the last one was just not losing enough weight, and Keys didn't believe that he wasn't cheating. So you can't sit with us.
Oh, it's so mean girls. Anyway, yes, cool.
The remaining 32 men entered the third and final official phase of the experiment called restricted rehabilitation. So this commenced on the 19th of July, 1945, and this would last 12 weeks or 3 months. So remember, this was sort of the core and crux of the study. They needed to starve the men so that they could figure out the best way to rehabilitate them. Now, many of the men actually didn't realize exactly what this phase meant. I think a lot of them thought, oh, this is where we get to go back to eating normally. But no, they didn't quite realize the restrictive element of this phase. It was going to be the same kind of food that was served in the semi-starvation phase, which, as I said, was very much based on food that was found in famished European areas of the time. So potatoes, cabbage, very little meat, those kind of things. I covered that in the last episode.
Okay.
But it was just going to be varying quantities. So that was going to be the difference. They were all divided up into 4 subgroups of 8 men that would receive different amounts of calories. I'm just going to list them off in case anyone wants to skip forward. It was 400, 800, 1200 or 1600 more calories than they were getting than the starvation period. So on top of the average 1500 that they were getting, again, based on their needs. So the 4 groups, they would be receiving 400, 800, 1200 or 600 more than that. Okay.
Triggering in my brain already, I guess maybe the conflicting nature of one group only getting 400 calories more and then one group getting, the highest amount more. I am listening.
Keys wanted to see the effects of the different calorie levels of increases and the effect that would have on the men. But of course, what group each of the men were in was actually kept a secret from the subjects. However, every single one of them assumed that they must have been in the lowest group and no one thought they were in the highest group.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah, so they all were just saying, there's no way that I'm in the highest group because they were all still so hungry.
Right. And were they sitting together? Like it's the same dining room they're all sitting in, so they can visually, I guess, to some level be able to see what the next person is eating and so forth. Okay, interesting.
But at the same time, they were also preferred being quite solitary and more isolated because
okay.
I can't tell you exactly what the seating configurations would look like, for example, but they were all still eating in the same room, but none of them assumed that they were in the highest group.
Wow. Okay. Interesting.
And of course, the COs still had to COs, conscientious objectors. So the COs still had to walk their 22 miles per week, and they were still in the buddy system throughout this whole phase.
Right. Okay.
Yeah. So what actually surprised many of the scientists in the lab was that many of the men began to actually lose weight rapidly early into this rehabilitation phase. And that was attributed to their edema in their legs and extremities correcting itself. So they were losing water quite quickly. But their weight also tended to sort of stay pretty much the same and was very slow. But I'll get into that. So 2.5 weeks into the restrictive rehabilitation phase, World War II actually ended. And it ended on the 15th of August, 1945, yet there was still 9.5 weeks left in the experiment. So Keyes was actually not able to publish his findings yet, which of course bothered him quite a little bit. But I'll get into that later. So despite the increase in calories, many of the men were still experiencing quite intense side effects. Many of the COs still had temptations to cheat, quote unquote. Their MMPI test, which as we remember is the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory test, which was used to sort of gauge their levels of depression, anxiety, hypochondria, all those kind of things. Their scores still showed significant feelings of depression and anxiety. They were still experiencing fatigue and physical discomfort, as well as poor circulation and dark patches on their skin. The biggest indicator of how fragile the psychological state of the men was an incident that occurred with a subject called Samuel Legg. So it occurred in the first few weeks of the rehabilitation phase. And here is a big old trigger warning. Samuel Legg was chopping wood and ended up chopping off 3 of his fingers. This incident occurred 1 week after he had dropped the weight of his car on the same hand after servicing it. So many years later, when asked if this was an accident, Legg replied, quote, "I admit to being crazy mixed up at the time. I'm not ready to say I did it on purpose. I'm not ready to say I didn't," end quote.
Okay. Wow.
Keyes was informed by a message via his wife, to which he replied, quote, "Oh God, I am torturing them," end quote. To which I say, no shit, Sherlock.
This is only just like come into your brain now?
Yeah.
Like you've only just come to that conclusion? That didn't like spark into your brain like, 6 months ago?
Yeah. The crazy thing is, Legg actually asked to stay in the experiment and his request was granted. And the main reason for that was that based on his MMPI scores, Keyes determined that as many as 8 men were deteriorating as much as Legg was. And Keyes, quote, couldn't risk removing 8 men from the remaining 32 without it ruining the experiment, end quote.
Oh.
They were all suffering, so it's fine.
Oh, it's like collective suffering, so it's all good. Wow. There's a part of me that I don't think is that surprised that he wanted to stay in the experiment.
And thank you. This is...
Oh, great. Okay, cool.
You just set it up perfectly for me.
All right.
He ultimately said to Keyes, quote, "Doctor, for the rest of my life, people are going to ask me what I did during the war. And this experiment is my chance to give an honorable answer to that question," end quote. So clearly the propaganda was working.
Yeah, definitely. Wow. And it's interesting, I guess, Ansel has broken him down to a point where, yeah, of course the propaganda is working because he wouldn't have the brain power, I guess, to consider otherwise. And this has been his entire life for the past almost year. So what else has he got, really? Yeah. That's interesting. Cool. Yeah. All right. Not cool, but
Yes. Following on from this, Keyes also came to the revelation that, quote, maybe the scientific goals he set were not possible to achieve in a humane way, end quote.
Only getting to that conclusion now?
Yes, exactly. Like, no shit.
Yay.
When it came to evaluating recovery, Keyes tracked, again, their weight, body fat, pulse rate, and depression scores from the MMPI. But he was also tracking to see if there was any kind of protein or vitamin supplements that would have any effect on the rate of recovery, which ultimately none of them did. In fact, he noticed that the 4 caloric groups, again, numbers in case anyone wants to skip ahead, which was the 400, 800, 1200, and 1600 on top of their semi-starvation intake, they all recovered at rates that were almost exactly proportional to the number of calories that they were consuming.
Interesting. Okay. Yeah.
So, but the rate of recovery, of course, was very slow. The men in the lower groups, so numbers here, so the 400 and 800 additional were barely gaining weight at all, although they were no longer losing weight that once the edema had disappeared.
Okay.
In fact, after 6 weeks into refeeding, the men in the lowest caloric group had only regained 1/10 of a pound, and the highest caloric group had only regained 6.5 pounds or nearly 3 kilos, which was 1/5 of the weight loss.
Holy dooly. And we consider, again, trigger warning for numbers and weights here. But if we think of modern day eating disorder treatment and I guess inpatient treatment for people who need to rehabilitate weight, they expect a 1.5 kilo jump weekly.
Exactly.
So, and there's always the element of like them being surprised when you're not able to make that gain every single week.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Interesting.
Yeah. It was at this stage that Keyes pretty much determined that it would take more than 3,000 calories per day to facilitate recovery.
No shit, Keyes.
All the markers that Keyes was tracking, which again I mentioned previously, pulse rate, heart rate, total blood volume, basal metabolic rate, and strength, they were all equally slow to return, with the one exception, and that was body fat. So during starvation, the rate in which the body's emergency energy supply of fat dropped more dramatically than the rate of body weight. And I say emergency supply of fat because that was the expression Todd Tucker used.
Okay.
And of course, these were very slim men. So, that's the context.
Yeah.
But in the recovery phase, the rate of body fat increased slightly faster than the rate of body weight. Now, I know that this freaks a lot of people out during eating disorder recovery, and to hear that body fat comes back at a faster rate. And I think that's something that Nick McDermott mentions all the time. And I think she mentioned it on her episode, is that so often in treatment, people say, oh, don't worry, you won't get fat. And that's all the fat phobia that is just built into eating disorder treatment.
Totally.
But we're not here to scare people about the process of refeeding, nor is gaining fat anything to be fearful of, because there's nothing wrong with gaining fat or being fat.
Yeah.
But in this instance, I just want to look a little bit further into this temporary shift in body weight and fat redistribution that often occurs after refeeding, because the rates in the Minnesota Starvation Study backs up what we already know about this distribution. We'll probably end up covering this topic properly with a dietitian at some point, but while we're on the topic, I just want to touch on it briefly. So I also found it fascinating for myself when going through recovery. And so often this can cause people to relapse after refeeding because their body composition completely changes. And this is, and it causes a lot of discomfort in your own body. And when body image and body dysmorphia is such a strong factor in eating disorders, that can really play into your mind. And obviously all bodies respond to weight restoration differently, but it's something that I personally experienced. But it's actually a really sophisticated thing that your body does after it's gone through something really traumatic like starvation. Your body will first hold on to body fat in the abdomen before it redistributes to the arms and legs, and also sometimes in your face as well. This process is designed to protect the vital organs and keep them safe. And it
Where
also
are
does
most of your vital organs?
Exactly. And it's also doing this to prepare for potentially another episode of famine. So this is extremely normal, and eventually weight will redistribute itself later on in a way that is completely normal for your body. Sometimes, as it did for me, it can take up to 12 months to 2 years, but body weight does eventually redistribute evenly.
Yeah, totally. And I guess with that as well, it's important to say, for some people, that may look like something completely out of the realms of what you think your body might look like post recovery. And I think that's one of the really important things to be mindful about when we're representing, I guess, the idea of recovery, because that's different for everybody.
Absolutely.
And that includes bodies. We have humans are meant to have such a vast range of different bodies and shapes, and fat to be in different places. So whatever that looks like for you will be entirely different to what that looks like for me, what that looks like for Ash.
Exactly.
For some, that is settling into a fat body, which is great as well, because
that's where your body's supposed to be.
Exactly right. And that's amazing for your body to be able to do that. And it's really important, because there's so much, like you said before, we won't let you get fat, as if that's the worst thing that somebody can be. And it's like, well, actually, that's not the goal.
Exactly. And I mean, I don't really want to talk about this too much, because this whole fat overshoot and redistribution should really not be a barrier to the biggest goal and benefit that is of eating disorder recovery, which is all about getting your life back. And that is not temporary at all. So our bodies are like infinitely intelligent, and it's doing what it needs to do to get better. And if you give your body what it needs from food and rest, you're giving it what it needs to heal from the trauma that it's gone through. And it's not about what your body looks like. And while there may be work to be done on the relationship you have with your new recovery body, which may be bigger or smaller than when you started, recovery is all about getting your body functioning normally again and being nutritionally restored. Also, you can go on to live a normal life again. And recovery is so much more than food and refeeding. I'm digressing, but I just wanted to bring that in.
I think it's important.
Yeah, especially when we're talking about this. If you're like, oh, so if I'm, gone from a starving body, I'm going to regain body fat first more than anything else. It's like, that's not what I'm saying.
Yes. No, I
anyway,
think that was important.
Back to 1945.
Yay.
As I said, all the markers were slow to return. Pulse rate in particular, after 6 weeks, they had only increased by 4.2 beats per minute on average. So many of the men began to feel despondent about their progress, and morale was still very low. I think a lot of them, like I said, were expecting a lot more food compared to the control, and that made the mood pretty sour. So at this point, after 6 weeks into the rehabilitation phase, halfway through that third phase, Keys decided to increase the amount of food that they were all receiving.
What about increase the variety of food? Don't just feed them onions?
I think it was more about keeping the control of it, and the only varying factor was the
amount.
quantity.
Okay, yeah, no, that makes sense.
Yeah. So But Keyes decided to increase the amount of food that they were all receiving.
Okay.
Some of the staff objected to this, saying that he was deviating from the plan and would undermine the current research.
What, but like, why is the staff concerned about that?
Well, ultimately, Keyes reminded them all that the aim of the study was, quote, not to starve people, end quote, but to rehabilitate people. And this was the goal of this very rehabilitation phase, to figure out how to feed people. I'm just going to quote again, and there are some numbers in here, so just be a watch out for that. Key said, quote, "We have proven that 400, 800, 1200 and 1600 additional calories won't do the job. We have a scientific duty in our remaining time to find out what will," end quote. So that was that. On the 9th of September, 1945, which again, like I said, halfway through the rehabilitation phase, they kickstarted the increase in calories with another relief meal. Morale was, boosted again. And from that point on, each group would receive an average extra 800 calories. So the 4 groups would increase to, and numbers here again, 1200, 1600, 2000, and 2,400 more calories than they received during the starvation period, which, as we remember, was an average of 1,500 calories. And because of this, they actually shifted back to 3 meals a day as opposed to 2. Their weight started to grow slowly, but general morale and mood among the COs came back rapidly. So they were getting very happy again.
Interesting. Okay.
Another change that happened at this time, and actually it was 4 days after the meal increases, they abolished the buddy system. So this happened because the men actually began demanding it of Keyes to the point where they were concerned about a mutiny in the lab. Yeah,
They're like, I'm sick of him. Get him away from me. Fair.
They actually saw this as a positive because the men started to feel better in themselves and spirits were starting to rise. And funnily enough, one of the comments made by the psychologists at the time said, quote, "Hungry people mindlessly follow orders. You feed them enough and right away they demand self-government," end quote.
Interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, I guess it's true, like, not to bring the mood down, although, given the subject matter.
I was going to say.
I think that's often why starvation and food restriction is often used in, I don't want to say, it is a torture technique.
Yeah.
And in, prisoner of war camps and things like that, because people become subservient. They become, they'll follow orders, and they're, it's a way of, breaking spirits essentially. Mm-hmm. So it's no surprise that when they started to be fed properly, they were like, "Hey, no, give us more," which is,
they probably had the energy to argue back as well.
That too. Yeah. So now the men were allowed to leave freely once again. But even with the increase in intake, they were still showing signs of fatigue because obviously healing yourself takes a lot of effort, it turns out. I mentioned in the previous episode that Keyes used a CAVD test as a screening process. So this was comprehension, arithmetic, vocabulary, and direction tests to measure intelligence. But he also used this test multiple times throughout the experiment to track any impacts that starvation had on intelligence. But Keyes actually found no significant changes to their intellectual performance.
Throughout the entire test, like an experiment?
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah. However, 28% of the subjects claimed, anecdotally, that is, that their memories worsened. 41% stated that they couldn't understand materials as well as they had before the experiment. And while this wasn't showing up in their results, Keyes attributed this self-evaluation to, quote, emotional distress, end quote.
I wonder if there's an element of perfectionism in there. Like they were deemed to be, generally intelligent, inverted commas, men. And we see it often. I know that's a part of your kind of story, Ash, where during uni, like you kind of like hyper focused on that and you had to do well at it. Even though I don't know if you can necessarily could recall everything that you learnt, or it was kind of just I had to be good at it. I wonder if there's an element of that to that.
Well, yeah. I mean, I'll get into it actually because...
Oh, okay, cool.
Well, what we know now, and I did a bit of research for this, was that starvation and restrictive eating disorders can cause brain fog.
Yeah.
Which the symptoms of which are, of course, reduced cognition, reduced concentration, loss of short-term memory, tasks that involve, mental activity take longer, inability to multitask,
Understandably.
difficulty forming thoughts or haziness in thoughts, slow thinking, and a loss of long-term memory. And of course, we contribute a lot of this to low blood sugar, vitamin deficiencies, as well as brain shrinkage, in particular, the loss of grey and white brain mass in the cerebellum, hypothalamus, frontal lobes, parietal lobes, and temporal lobes. I'm hoping I pronounced all that correctly.
I think you did.
Brain fog, that's what it does. But I also have a personal anecdote about this. I remember actually, it wasn't to do with uni, but it was right before I entered treatment for the first time. I had to go to the ATM to get cash out back when that was still a thing. And for some reason, my mum had told me her PIN like a week earlier, and I memorized it because I was using it for something. But then when I went to use ATM to get the cash out using my card, I had completely forgotten my own PIN. And this was a PIN number that I had, for years.
Yeah.
But I could not remember for the life of me. All I could remember was my mum's PIN number. I tried a bunch to the point where my card was actually locked. So I had to go into a branch and redo it. And I'd say, hey, yeah, I just actually completely forgot.
Yeah.
And I'd been, like I said, using it for years. And all I can put it down to, I think, was being so unwell that my brain was like, no, don't need that information, delete.
Kind of like prioritizing information almost. It's funny, I have an almost identical story to that where I went to go and pay for something with my card, and back then you had to put your PIN number in every time you paid for something with your card. And I remember standing at the checkout, it might have been for like fuel, and I remember standing there and just being like, I genuinely cannot remember my PIN number. And I stood there for ages and I was like, it's gone.
Yeah.
Like and this is a PIN number. I've still got the same PIN number and I've had it since I was like 13.
Yeah.
And I had to end up calling the bank. And like, this sounds ridiculous, but like I genuinely cannot remember it. Yeah, interesting. Prioritizing information, kind of like your body prioritizing energy and all that sort of stuff.
Exactly.
Yeah, okay, makes sense.
So obviously Keyes didn't find any clinical findings outside what he deemed as this anecdotal evidence, but that was also based on the tests that he was taking, so 1945. So I think, given again what we know now about brain fog and brain shrinkage and things like that, I think that's probably what was going on, and that this is what the men were actually complaining about. It's like, I actually have trouble remembering things and concentrating on things like that.
Yeah, makes sense.
So I'm going to rattle off some final numbers here because we're getting to the end of this restricted rehabilitation phase. So skip ahead if you don't really want to hear this. Their original weights, if you remember, were an average of 152.7 pounds or 69 kilograms. By the end of the semi-starvation phase, it was down to 115.6 pounds or 52 kilograms. And after 12 weeks of refeeding into this rehabilitation phase, the average had risen to 129 pounds or 58.6 kilograms. So even after 12 weeks, but then again, also only 6 weeks of quite increased calories, the CEOs had only regained 36.7% of what they'd lost during the experiment.
Interesting.
Even those in the highest caloric group, so those consuming numbers here, 2,400 calories on top of their semi-starvation stage rations, still weighed on average 10% less than their starting weights. The last day of the experiment was on the 20th of October, 1945, and it was celebrated with a huge banquet for the men. And just like that, it was officially over.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
What a way to end.
So I mentioned before in the last episode that Keyes was getting pretty antsy, that his paper was not going to be published or ready in time to help those who required feeding after the war. This was, as you remember, one of the core reasons why the experiments was even being conducted in the first place. So he was worried that he was going to miss the boat entirely and that someone else was going to do it. So Keyes actually published an interim report on October 15th, 1945. So this was just 5 days before the end of the experiment, but it was nearly 5 months after the end of the war in Europe.
Okay.
He published a sort of report which was called Experimental Starvation in Man, which was a 48-page document which outlined the basis of the study that he was conducting and was largely descriptive of what starvation did to the human body. Granted, the thin, white, and male human body, but yeah. Because the rehabilitation phase wasn't completed or analysed, Keyes couldn't publish any practical information. He couldn't convey much to the relief workers actually working on the feeding of the hungry at all. Out of the whole booklet, there were just 10 lines that were dedicated to rehabilitation, which was mostly just a promise of future information, which was largely, quote, the results of the rehabilitation studies will be reported separately as the results are obtained and analyzed, end quote. There was a final stage, unofficially. It was called the unrestricted rehabilitation phase, which was not included in the final study or paper at all. I'm going to talk about this, then circle back to the study itself, chat about some ethics, and then round up with a general summary. So that's our itinerary from here on out.
I love it.
So this unrestricted rehabilitation phase was an 8-week phase, which included just 12 of the COs, 3 from each of the calorie groups, and they all continued to stay in the lab. Their diets were unsupervised, but they periodically analyzed them to grasp any lasting effects on starvation. I'm just going to mention some numbers here. So on the first week, they consumed an average of 5,219 calories. Now, it didn't mention whether this was self-reported data or not, but given that it was unsupervised, I can only imagine that it was. So we can only assume that the volume of food was actually likely higher than that, given that, as the research tells us, self-reported data of food intake can be underestimated as much as 50%.
What, they don't have MyFitnessPal? Sorry, I had to.
Hello.
I had to. I was like, couldn't not. Okay.
Exactly. I mean, I say that they may have been underestimating it, but if they were in an experiment that was all about food for the last year, so they could have been documenting it, or maybe they were just more aware of their consumption. But take that intake number with a grain of salt, really. Many men reported eating to the point of vomiting or gastric distension, and these episodes became so frequent that the lab staff actually eventually introduced some level of dietary control during the weekdays, but then unrestricted on weekends, which of course led to a pattern of what they called weekend gorging, end quote.
A bit of a restrict binge cycle there.
Mm-hmm. So
okay.
some even reported that they would eat 50 to 200% more on weekends. Psychologically, the remaining COs expressed that they would still feel hungry even after they were so full to the point they couldn't eat anymore. And many also described irrational fears that food would be taken away again, which we saw happen with this weekday dietary control, right?
No shit, Ansel.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Overall, 32% of the participants, not just those in the unrestricted rehabilitation phase, recalled episodes of binge eating in the subsequent weeks post-study. And again, I use the term binge eating, which is a strict caveat here, because in this instance, it's very much linked to the effects of starvation and deprivation.
So a larger amount of food.
Yeah. And this can be seen obviously in eating disorders and disordered eating and dieting as well. Your body is biologically wired to seek food and store that food for the next period of famine.
Yeah.
As soon as your body realizes that there's no famine anymore and you return to a diet that's no longer restricted or deprived of anything, those urges to binge can subside.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a really good point to make where, I think now it's very much encouraged to honor, like, that is a real hunger
drive.
It might be the mental hunger. It might not even be a physical hunger. It might be the mental hunger. And it's just as important to honor that and to kind of sit through that period of where your body is just needing everything until it gets to a point where, obviously there's nuance there and, but yeah.
Physically, on the other hand, there were rapid improvements overall. Their weights increased. One man's pulse rate dramatically improved from 36 beats per minute to 60 beats per minute.
Oh, yay.
Yeah, and the same man's basal metabolic rate nearly doubled 3 days into this period.
3 days? Wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
So the COs reported reduced lethargy, dizziness, and apathy, and they were some of the first things to go once they started eating adequately again.
Are they still having to have the same like walking requirements and treadmill requirements? And
I don't think so. I didn't say.
Yeah.
I would imagine that probably not.
Yeah, because I'm guessing if it's unrestricted, they would have they're kind of getting to do what they want. So I'm guessing maybe not, unless there's, or that would be interesting. But anyway, Ansel, why didn't you put that in? But okay.
Well, I guess because it wasn't part of the study, I can only assume that it they that wouldn't be a requirement anymore. But
yeah,
I'm surprised that it wasn't mentioned in the book.
I'd be interested to see if any of them did voluntarily, like out of their own choice, keep that kind of timetable up. But yeah, okay. Anyway,
this phase ended on the 20th of December, 1945, after 8 weeks, and this was followed up by 2 additional follow-ups, one in March 1946 and the other in August 1946. There was also an unofficial follow-up in 1991 at a participant reunion, which was attended by 16 of the COs who were evaluated by a questionnaire. This was organized by one of the COs themselves and just brought everyone together.
Oh my God, that's like quite some time after. How old were they then?
Well, based on, there's one a little bit later, but I think the average age was around 70.
Oh, I'm listening. This is interesting. Okay.
Yeah, so 80% agreed with the statement, the experiment increased my capacity to cope with adversity. 60% would encourage their own sons to participate in a similar study.
No.
And many said it was the most important experience of their lives.
No. 80%.
80% agreed that it increased their capacity to cope with adversity, yeah.
And then what was the percent? I think I was just what?
60% would encourage their own sons to participate in a similar study.
That's huge. That opens up a whole lot of generational stuff, doesn't it?
Absolutely.
Oh my God.
Yeah, and then many said it was the most important experience of their lives. None of the participants experienced any long-term physical, cognitive, or emotional adverse effects, but 10 of the men stated their perceptions and perspectives regarding food were permanently altered by the study, which I think is fairly understandable.
And I wonder how accurate that is, though. If, again, self-reporting that they didn't experience any, physical, maybe we can kind of believe that a little bit more, but emotional, like the emotional and mental aspect of it.
Yeah.
If that's self-reported, and I mean, we just heard that 60% would recommend their son go through a similar experiment. I wonder if we kind of take that with a grain of salt because,
Yeah. I mean, I've always said like unlearning stuff is a lot harder than learning stuff.
Totally.
And I mean, having food being put under such an intense focus and going through something life-changing is bound to shift perceptions, right? So I wonder, I'd love to go back and wonder if there was any sort of anti-fat bias that really
I'm sure there would have been. I think we could probably assume, especially at the times, right? 1991.
But this would probably almost be even more amplified. Or maybe it would have had the opposite effect. Who knows? I don't know.
Yeah, interesting. Okay. I find that very interesting.
It is very important to note that not one of these men went on to develop an eating disorder. But I will get into the differences between this study and an eating disorder later. But that I found, starvation doesn't cause eating disorders. 1998 was the last scientific survey of the subjects, and this was conducted by Dr. Scott Crow of the University of Minnesota. At this point, the average age of the COs was 78, so it was considered one of the last times and last chances to actually work with the men. Dr. Crow was able to track down 19 of the original 36. 11 had passed away and 6 were unable to be located.
Okay.
So Dr. Scott Crow is an expert in eating disorders, and he's the editor-in-chief of Eating Disorders Review and a member of editorial boards for a number of eating disorder journals. So his final investigation reflected this interest.
Okay.
So he found that at times the men had greatly distorted body images, expressing that they saw many of those who were not part of the experiment as fat, and they were unaware of their own skeletal appearances. Crow also found that most of the men had exceeded their control period weights significantly in the years following the experiment by an average of 27 pounds or 12 kilos, but most of the men gradually returned to their original weights over several years, with the exception of 3 of the COs. So, hello, Set Point, and hello, future episode.
Yeah. Actually, that's going to be so interesting because so many people love to argue on that, and it's a whole like gym bro thing. But anyway, continue.
Yeah. So again, now back to 1945. I want to talk a little bit about the study that was published, like the actual study that exists, and the paper. So as predicted, World War II led to starvation on a humongous scale. From this, there was an avalanche of data as well as first-hand reports that Keyes actually wanted to scour through before he put his paper together to ensure that it was as robust as possible. He received data from the Netherlands, Greece, and of course from the concentration camps across Europe, the atrocities of which had now completely come to light now that the war was over.
Okay.
On this note, Keyes did acknowledge the chilling contrast of, obviously, that these reports had to the sterile data from the lab. And in his report, he wrote, quote, "The situation was worse than had been believed possible even from the most somber predictions, and the conditions for trying out the procedures for rehabilitation were far from satisfactory," end quote. So Keyes wanted to include more than just 12 months of this data from the experiment because he wanted to publish a complete seminal study of hunger, whether that be also the history, its effect on every aspect of the body. He also particularly wanted to fill the gaps that his study had, having only used young white men as his data set. And it only took 199 pages of Todd Tucker's book for him to recognize this.
Oh my God.
Keyes saw and mentioned the parallels between sexual impotence of starving men and the onset of amenorrhea, so the cessation of menstruation. He gathered this information specifically from data from occupied Marseille, which, quote, estimated 70% of women ceased having their periods and the onset of menstruation was delayed among starving adolescent girls, end quote.
Okay. Do you want to tell people where Marseille is?
Marseille is in France, I believe.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yes.
Nailed it. Pass the test.
Yes.
a little town in France that was, taken over by enemy troops.
Despite the post-war hunger problem in Europe had relatively passed him by, Keyes was, he kept going in his pursuit of publishing this paper. And I'm actually going to send you something. Here are the main findings.
Okay.
So, and again, this is from Todd Tucker's book. Let me send it to you. There you go.
Quote, "Up to a point, the results demonstrated that the pace of recovery was directly related to, and only to, the level of calories consumed. Neither the protein supplement or vitamin supplement had any appreciable effect on the rate or the degree of recovery." Keyes was careful to point out that the experiment's basic rehabilitation diet, designed as it was to look like an actual European relief diet in the field, already contained a decent amount of protein, around 75 grams per day. Many people hoped or expected science to come up with a magical combination of proteins and vitamins that would hurry the rehabilitation process along. Such a potion didn't exist. He wrote, "We do not wish to qualify our conclusion that the calorie intake is the single nutritional element of the highest importance in rehabilitation feeding of persons starved on a European type of famine diet." End quote.
So that was the core finding, was that it doesn't matter if there's increased supplements or anything. The thing that is going to help refeed people is food, and a lot of it.
Were people disappointed by that result?
Well, I mean, apparently. I think people just wanted to have a really, it's kind of funny, like diet culture, right? We want a quick fix, quick thing of, just, I want to lose weight really, really fast. Now it's almost like the opposite effect. We just want a quick fix on how to get these people healthy.
Totally.
And get these people, refed again.
And I think that's why, like, sometimes with like the wellness industry marketing, like, these greens powders and all of these vitamins and, all of these stuff and protein powders and stuff to, like, I think there's a reason why those with eating disorders are perhaps really targeted there, or perhaps, want to, I don't know about you, but I spent a lot of money on those sort of things because it gave me the illusion that it would make me healthy. And, what I was, my eating disorder was justified because I was still healthy. Look at me, I'm doing all these health things.
You're doing what you're supposed to do.
I feel like that's very much a mindset, like you said, that is very much still present.
Yeah. So finally, in 1950, so 5 years after the war had ended, the University of Minnesota published The Biology of Human Starvation. It was a 2-volume, 1,385-page work that was immediately hailed as the seminal work on starvation, which, let's be honest, is exactly what Keyes wanted, right?
Yeah, well, yeah.
It consisted of 4 forewords, 2 indices, 565 data tables, a bibliography that went on for 86 single-spaced pages
Stop it.
and cited more than 2,800 sources.
Oh,
Quite a masterpiece.
I have a headache. Imagine picking that up and being like, oh, I'm going to read this. No, thank you. Okay.
Yeah, which is also why I'm extremely thankful for books like Todd Tucker's, because he was able to read all that. Sir Jack Drummond, who was a distinguished biochemist, he did a lot of work on nutrition, particularly on the British diet under rationing during World War II. Mm-hmm. He wrote in one of the forewords, quote, "My admiration was tinted with only one regret, that the investigation had not begun 3 years earlier," end quote. And Keyes agreed on this in his own foreword, which said, quote, "We regret, of course, that this work was not published when the hunger of the world was more acute than now," end quote. So while the immediate problem of starvation had passed, Keyes hoped that his published work could be a comprehensive reference of one of mankind's biggest problems, and that it could be used by doctors and scientists for decades to come. And I guess he got his wish, right?
Yeah, totally.
Now, this study can never be repeated, and I'm going to talk about why, even though it can be fairly obvious. But Todd Tucker explained it really well in his book.
Okay.
Before I go into this, a little bit of a trigger warning. I'm just going to talk a little bit about some World War II history context stuff. So if you'd rather just not hear about that, which I totally understand, just skip ahead. So as I mentioned in the last episode, following the conclusion of the war, the atrocities at Nuremberg were uncovered, which of course included the inhumane and often fatal human experiments conducted on concentration camp victims without consent. What followed was the Nuremberg trial, and this trial was the first international war crimes trial in history, and it revealed the true extent of German atrocities and held some of the most prominent Nazis accountable for their crimes. As a result of this trial, the Nuremberg Code was established. The Nuremberg Code, according to an article that I found in the ABC, is a set of 10 principles that were developed in 1947 that are designed to protect human subjects in medical research. The first principle of the code states that, quote, "voluntary consent of the human subject is absolutely essential," end quote. Quote, "Other principles include that the experiment should be for the good of society, that all unnecessary physical and mental suffering or injury should be avoided, and no experiment should be conducted if there is good reason to believe it may result in death or a disabling injury," end quote. One last quote and then we'll circle back. Quote, "They also say that the human subject should be free to exit the experiment if they are suffering, and that the scientist in charge must be prepared to end the experiment if they have good reason to believe it may cause injury, disability, or death to the subject if it continues," end quote. So based on these principles alone, there is no way that this study would be allowed to be repeated.
Oh my God. Sorry, this is completely like off podcast, but it's just like, as you were reading those, because obviously I knew like kind of what those, like the Nuremberg Code was, but just remember during COVID, like everyone's like, the Nuremberg Code. Like,
oh my God. Yeah. That's why this was an article in the ABC, right? And it was quite recent. It was like, so everyone's mentioning the Nuremberg Code. Let's talk about what that actually means.
Oh my God. Anyway, cool. Yeah.
But because of its association with Nazi war crimes, the code had relatively little effect on practice, according to the British Medical Journal.
Oh.
Yeah. So in 1964, the World Health Organization created a new set of standards for experiments on humans that would aim to expand on the Nuremberg Code. Like, obviously the Nuremberg Code is still around and it's still a valid document and a valid thing.
Yeah.
But they wanted to sort of expand on that. So they did this at its 18th World Medical Assembly in Helsinki, Finland. And again, this was 1964. So this was known as the Helsinki Declaration, which some of you may have heard of. And it was deemed more effective in terms of clinical research using human subjects. In particular, it provided clarity and guidance on voluntary consent and was, in contrast to the Nuremberg Code, endorsed by the global medical community and designed with a focus on clinical research, as I said. So while the Nuremberg Code was a legal document, it was seen as a set of guidelines for barbarian Nazi doctors, essentially. And the Helsinki Declaration was created by physicians of the world and has since been updated multiple times to adopt to modern society. You'd hope so.
I'm just kind of like dumbfounded that you need to like it needed to be like the Nuremberg Code needed to be expanded upon because like it kind of outlined pretty basically like don't like harm people.
Well, actually, not really. What happened
Okay.
was one thing it did was it divided research into two broad classifications, right?
Okay.
Therapeutic research and non-therapeutic research.
Okay.
So I think the main thing was non-therapeutic trials, which was all about conducting research that had, no likelihood or intent of producing a diagnostic, preventative, or therapeutic benefit to the current subjects, although it may benefit subjects with similar conditions in the future. So non-therapeutic was more investigative things, and it really helped define consent in terms of that. It also expanded the consent to include people who may not be responsive, and it allows people to seek consent from a guardian or a parent or guardian or caretaker, that kind of thing.
Ah, okay.
Whereas therapeutic trials are ones which enroll patients and provide a specific treatment to the patients to study its impacts, right?
Yeah, okay.
So that's what the main difference of the Helsinki Declaration did in comparison to the Nuremberg Code, which
yeah, okay.
I found really interesting.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. Okay.
I guess I wanted to give an exact context of what kind of governing guidance are in place today that really prohibit things like this happening again. And of course, there's way more detail into both of these sets of guidelines that I haven't covered, and I'm hoping that I got all of it talking on it accurately, but hopefully that gives you a general idea because I had no idea until now.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
The more you know.
The more you know. Na, na, na.
Oh, God.
I'm going to be solely referencing a great summary from Todd Tucker's book now, which kind of brings all of this together in terms of why the experiment can't be repeated again.
Okay.
I've cut some of this down, but I found this so interesting to the point where I think I sent you actually a copy, like a little fraction of this excerpt. All right.
Yeah.
Quote, could the Minnesota Starvation Experiment be conducted today? Most people alive today who were connected with the experiment reflexively say no, that today the Helsinki Declaration would not allow it. The Helsinki Declaration does allow non-therapeutic research, given that consent is obtained and risks explained, all of which Ansel Keys did on his own. Some might make the case that the risks were unknown, but of course this is always true to some extent. This is why scientists conduct experiments. Some might also argue about the quality of consent given by the CPS men. They were, after all, compelled by the selective service system to do something. There are many alternatives, however, and even now, knowing all that they know, the surviving test subjects almost all say they would volunteer to do it again.
Wow.
Dr. David Smith, a psychologist at the University of Notre Dame, says the experiment would never be allowed by modern ethical guidelines, end quote.
Okay.
So it does kind of touch on what we said last episode, right? Like how much of these volunteers were actually volunteers,
Well, I mean, it was kind of do that or like go to jail, as we said. So,
or go working, as a chaplain or, things like that,
Yeah, right. Although I feel like I would have chosen maybe like, wasn't there a testing soil one?
Soil conservation, yes.
Yeah, I feel like I would have chosen that over. Like, seems a bit nicer. But anyway.
The book also then goes on to talk about what we mentioned in the last episode. Quote, the experiment could never be conducted today because no scientist could ever gather together 36 men willing to live under a football stadium for a year without pay in order to lose a quarter of their body weight. Ethical guidelines are organic, flexible things that adjust with the times and needs of society. The circumstances that made the starvation experiment possible will never happen again. End quote.
Live under a football stadium ever again. Like, no shit.
And I think, that's why this study is so important and valuable now, right?
Yeah.
While he could not have known it couldn't have been done again, he wanted to conduct a study that had never been done before and still remains the most definitive work on the subject, right?
Yeah.
The last thing I will say on this, and is definitely worth talking about, and it's something that I hadn't actually considered until researching this even further. If knowledge is gained through unethical means, is it ethical to use that research? And the response to this question is actually very split. So one clinical ethicist, Lynn Gillian, I hope I'm pronouncing your last name correctly, said in 2015, quote, using unethical obtained data would send the message that the experiment wasn't so bad after all, and even encourage morally blinkered doctors to do their own unethical experiments, end quote. Similarly, Fareed Awan, the ethics professor at the University of Washington, said in a personal interview in 2018, quote, "There are many examples of unethical experiments that would be very useful for science, medicine, and even the world. But when that means violating human rights, exploiting people, or disrespecting individuals, that is still wrong, even if the result would still be good," end quote. On the other hand, in 2004, the US National Research Council said, quote, "It would be possible to use unethical obtained data to protect the public without creating an incentive for future breaches of the relevant ethical rules," end quote. And this is a view that is shared by Kyle McKittrick. Again, hope I'm pronouncing your last name correctly. He is a bioethicist and a program director at the Institute for Ethics and Emerging Technology. In 2011, he said, quote, "It is impossible to give back or take away knowledge. We have an obligation to those who had their human rights violated by unethical experimentation to do the most good possible with the results of their experimentation," end quote. I can absolutely see the argument on both sides here.
So can I. Yeah.
Yeah. What do you do with the research that was obtained unethically by standards that were not in place at the time of the experiment being conducted, right?
Exactly right. That didn't exist then.
Yeah. I mean, look, I don't have the answer because I don't really feel like I'm qualified to really make that assessment, but it's definitely food for thought. I mean, what do you think?
Interesting. So immediately when you were like, we shouldn't use, like, all of those reasons not to use it, I'm like, well, yeah. And then I think what popped up for me was then it opens the door then for, I guess, unethical doctors to do underhanded, below the table research, potentially, because I think we know that there are many, I guess, patients within the system that are there involuntarily. We know that often, there's things that you can employ like the Mental Health Act, and there's a lot of people that experience a lot of trauma in these systems because of doctors and the things that they then do to them. So that kind of triggers that for me. And I think that's a really relevant point. On the other hand, I do get that, well, we've got that research there now. Like you said, at the time, there was no ethics, although does that negate just because there were no ethics, does that mean you can just do whatever the hell you want?
Yeah, exactly.
I don't think so. Yeah. But, it's done. And would it be a waste of, putting these men through like suffering, a lot of suffering, to then just be like, no, we can't use it at all? I don't know.
Yeah.
Like you said, I think it informs. Like I think I'm curious then if we don't use it, right, within our current research, if people do not use it, then what do we use? Because like you said, we can't reenact this. This will never happen again. So then what do we use? Yeah. And I also wonder, I would say that we use research from the war times. Like I think we would use research findings from concentration camps, findings from, a lot of things that were unethical and traumatic and awful during many times. Yeah, it's interesting that it's interesting on both sides. And also
it's an interesting debate, right? And
it really is. And I can't come to a conclusion on either side.
Yeah. Neither. Yeah. And look, I think we'll pose the question to people listening.
Yeah.
I feel that, there's arguments on both sides. This is obviously a horrific experiment.
Yeah.
And it is just very lucky that no one lost their life.
Yeah.
And that at some point some of the men were taken out. But even then, it's a conundrum. So I just wanted to pose that question because it was something that I hadn't really thought about. And
neither.
It's, again, something that I do feel that I do have a duty to sort of bring that question up, given that we are talking about it. And
totally.
Here I am saying, it's a really interesting study, but you have to also think about the ethical implications of me sharing this information as well.
Totally.
It's a conversation to be had.
Yes, I agree.
That's pretty much all I can sort of.
I agree.
That's all I can say on that one, really.
I agree.
So I'm going to start to bring us in for a landing and begin to round up this episode. And I'm going to do that by mentioning probably one of the most relevant parts in Tucker's book, which, is relevant to us. And this is the part that I think I screenshotted or I took a photo of and I sent it to you. I'm like, oh my God, this.
Yes. I know which part you're about to say.
Yes. Sorry, I'm taking this directly from Tucker's book. Quote, "The Minnesota Starvation Study is especially useful to researchers of anorexia nervosa. Ash's side note here, but also restrictive eating disorders in general.
Love it.
Back to the quote. As Keyes himself said in the study, the experiment more closely duplicated the conditions of anorexia than it did concentration camp prisoners. The study is invaluable for those treating anorexia because it helps separate the symptoms that are a result of anorexia from those that are just a byproduct of hunger. The hunger must be treated first. As one anorexia researcher wrote after citing the characteristics of starvation noted by Keyes, trying to make meaningful psychological changes with an anorexic patient in this starved state is analogous to trying to address underlying issues with an alcoholic patient who is intoxicated, end quote. Which I think is a massive mic drop moment. And there's two big things in there, right? And the first being that this is exactly why medical and nutritional restoration must come first in eating disorder treatment.
Absolutely.
And something that you talk a lot about, you know, going, for example, in an inpatient setting, an inpatient, you know, the expectations are that you're not coming out the other side fixed, or that, you know, that you're going to have all the tools that you need in order to fix or treat your eating disorder, right?
Absolutely.
The goal of inpatient care is restoration and nutrition, like nutritionally and physically, right?
Yeah.
And that's the main goal.
Yeah.
You can't treat a person whose brain is starved because the treatment won't work properly.
It's actually, if we want to talk about ethics, it's unethical as well.
There you go. It's kind of like trying to do physio on a knee that isn't even finished surgery yet. You know what I mean?
Yeah, totally. It's honestly, you know, we talked before about brain fog and how, you know, parts of your brain, like the gray matter and the white matter, are reduced. It's very relevant because if we're trying, you know, we know a lot of people with eating, and I'll say across the board eating disorders because it's not just anorexia nervosa.
Absolutely. I also like that whole section. I'm like, it's eating disorders, not just anorexia. So
no, absolutely. Yeah. So across the board with eating disorders, we know that obviously they're so multifaceted and we have so much more information these days, you know, to know that there's intersectionalities, there's trauma, there's, you know, a whole bunch of stuff that are underneath these eating disorders, you know, that the eating disorder, the eating whatever is just kind of the tip of the iceberg. And then you've got, you know, underneath the water. But we talked about that brain fog and what it does to your brain. You are unable to do that work because where is that going to land? And it is actually, as a clinician, it's unethical to address that stuff. Like, yes, on a base level you can, but to actually, you know, if you've got trauma there that you need to do proper trauma therapy on, if you did that on a starved brain, well, actually, what could the effect of doing that on a starved brain be? Because we think about it, do you have the capacity to do that? And if you try, what is that going to do to you? Do you have the capacity to cope with the feelings that are going to come up, or the memories that are going to come up, or the flashbacks that are going to come up? Probably not.
Yeah, exactly.
So it's actually extremely unethical. And exactly like you said, inpatient for most people going into these places, it has a purpose, yeah. For some people it might be, you know, they need a break from, like, it's just all too much to do by themselves. So they need a break. They need extra help. They need maybe supervision, something along those lines. Somebody put it really well to me not long ago. They see it as kind of like a resuscitation point, right? Sometimes within the eating disorder treatment world, we have that revolving door of people just going in and going out, going in and going out. That's not using inpatient for, you know, the purpose that it is intended to be. It should be like a resuscitation point. And that doesn't mean I want you to get to a point where you need to like literally be resuscitated. Obviously not. Like, but it might be a break point. It might be, I just can't do this by myself anymore. I need extra help. It might be medical rehabilitation. It might be nutritional rehabilitation, whatever it is. That's the focus. And if we focus on that, then you get to come out hopefully with, you know, a more nutritionally and rehabilitated self to then be able to do all of the work that's underneath your eating, all of the deep-rooted causes of your actual eating disorder.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's a big tangent that like I get on very often.
No,
it's just very misrepresented within the treatment world, right? You know, how often did you hear like, oh, they're just focusing on the food. They're just making me eat. They're not even addressing my psychological worries. They're not even, you know, psychologist isn't even doing anything with me. Well, no, they're not, because they're not meant to be.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
Like, what's the point of them doing that? That's not where you're at.
Exactly. one thing that last passage touched on was it uses the study to distinguish the differences between the mental illness of an eating disorder and the effects of starvation. And that's what I want to finish on. So thanks for making it this far for all of this.
Yeah.
It's
been
let's look
awesome.
At this.
I've loved it. It's super interesting. So well done.
Thanks. Let's look at the similarities first. Most of which, of course, we've covered mainly in the last episode, but also a little bit here. Mm-hmm. I think when I was going through the list of physical and psychological effects last episode, many people, including myself, would have been nodding their heads in agreement on a lot of those symptoms, which I think we've covered already. Mm-hmm. The cognitive and physical effects that were documented in the study were nearly identical to those experiences commonly reported by those with restrictive eating disorders. Again, similarly, as I mentioned before, the way the body recovers from starvation is similar to the way a body recovers from a restrictive eating disorder sometimes, because it's essentially the same thing. Mm-hmm. So there are changes in the body composition and how the body prioritizes weight distribution when recovering. So those are, some of the real sort of similarities between the starvation experiment and the side effects that the CEOs went through, as well as those who live with restrictive eating disorders. But the differences, I want to look at those now, and they're a little bit, more extensive. And I think that's important, right? So obviously this starvation was forced onto the CEOs and was part of the experiment that they voluntarily, quote unquote, enrolled in, right?
Yeah.
But with an eating disorder, the restrictions are decided and placed upon the person themselves. I'm not saying that they do it to themselves, but is it's I don't want to say the word self-inflicted, but even if it happens very gradually, very slowly, these are rules that people place on themselves.
Yeah, and even if they do come externally from family members or friends or whatever, ultimately, like when the eating disorder is there, I suppose, for lack of a better term, it is very much, self-directed almost. Yeah.
And that I think is the biggest difference.
Okay.
The CEOs were driven by a need to comply and a need to do something for the greater good, whereas EDs, as we know, are driven by a multitude of things.
Yeah.
It could be fear, self-punishment, self-loathing, trauma, poor body image, anxiety, coping mechanisms, body dysmorphia. The list is very long, and they vary from person to person.
Yeah.
Another difference is that increasing calories is very often a source of stress and anxiety for those who live with eating disorders. But for the CEOs, it wasn't. In fact, it was quite the opposite. Increased calories and more food was very much welcomed. And I'm not saying that, one thing that I want to touch on there is when I first entered treatment, I did feel this massive sigh of relief that I was allowed to eat again. And there was that joy of, oh, I can eat again. Yeah. So for those who, like me, sometimes with I hate food. I don't like hearing people, I hate food. I can't stand it. I freaking loved food and I enjoyed eating properly again.
Yeah.
But your eating disorder is the one that tells you that you don't want to,
It's such a comparison thing, especially in an inpatient setting of but that person's really struggling with that meal and I'm not struggling at all. I'm not doing it right. No, throw that in the bin.
Yes. All the CEOs were screened for physical and mental health risk factors prior to being exposed to the experiment, while today there is very little screening, if any common screening practices for the general population when it comes to risk factors of developing eating disorders. And very often they manifest from other mental illnesses. So
yes. One thing that pops up for me when you say that is pregnancy actually is a huge trigger for people, but it is not screened for at all.
Yeah.
It's not about you.
The CEOs were starved under honestly the best possible conditions. The men described feeling very safe. They had access to medical care at all times. They were around people constantly. They were regularly screened, and they also had an endpoint that they could look towards. Whereas eating disorders are far more dangerous, and they often thrive in isolated and secretive environments. And unless you're in an inpatient treatment, your vitals are not monitored on a day-to-day basis.
Totally, yeah.
And can be chronic and ongoing without any intervention.
Yeah.
So the depression, poor self-worth, feelings of helplessness, pain and distress are more often than not monitored either, and can be very dangerous, as they were for the CEOs in the experiment, but they had people monitoring them and things like that.
Totally. And if you think of a trauma environment as well, if you have a bit of a trauma component there and you're actively living in that trauma, very much not safe. So yeah, good point.
The COs never mentioned any body image issues prior to the experiment, and even during the rehabilitation phase when the weight was returning, none of the COs mentioned any sort of body image, except for what they mentioned of like they noticed that their perceptions were warped.
Yeah, okay.
But it was never, oh, I'm getting fat, this is a bad thing.
Yeah,
you know what I mean?
Yeah.
We know that body image plays a massive role in eating disorders, so massive difference there.
Yeah.
And of course, we've definitely covered it throughout, but we'll hammer it home once again. This study was on a bunch of young, thin, privileged white men from the 1940s, so we cannot use this data as an exact representation of starvation on all humans.
Yeah.
Eating disorders can affect anyone and are not limited to a particular type of person. And eating disorders can have different effects on different bodies. But as we've said this entire time, we're looking at the results as they were, given that we don't have an alternative data set.
Yeah.
Lastly, I think it's important to reiterate something I said earlier, which was that none of the men developed an eating disorder as a result of this experiment. Starvation alone does not cause an eating disorder. Eating disorders are mental illnesses, and they are conditions of the mind that manifest in the body.
Sometimes. And I think that's a good, a combative point for the comparison that those who suffer from an eating disorder love to draw to other people, but they can do X, Y, Z behavior. And it's like, yes, that's not ideal, obviously, like that's unhealthy in and of itself. However, they don't have an eating disorder.
Yeah, exactly.
The protective component of, I guess, recovery maintenance, protecting your recovery. If you have a history of eating disorders, you can't go on a diet. Losing a lot of weight might be dangerous, or, having any kind of restriction to your diet will likely be dangerous. So yeah,
exactly.
Very important point to make.
So while this study can be used to gain insight into the effects that malnutrition and starvation can have on the human body, it should definitely not be used as a guide for eating disorder treatment, because refeeding, obviously, because refeeding and weight and nutrition restoration is just one portion of eating disorder recovery. It is critical, of course, this weight restoration for those who need to do that. But the cognitive and psychological treatment of eating disorders is equally important when it comes to recovery. And it's equally important. I'm not going to say it's more important, but the latter part, the psychological treatment cannot properly begin until weight and nutrition is restored as well, as we talked about.
I mean, I almost would be like, oh, it kind of is more important because, ultimately that's the thing that will help you get to a life of, a better life, that mental recovery, because like you said, it's a mental illness. It's not a physical illness. But also because for a large portion of the population, there actually isn't that physical component to recovering from an eating disorder, which I find is an extremely important point, because we always, it's the typical, we think of what an eating disorder looks like, but actually it doesn't look like that. An eating disorder looks like nothing and everything. So less than 6% of those who have an eating disorder are actually even underweight. So yes, there might be that nutritional rehabilitation component, which is equally as important no matter, where you sit in the eating disorder scale. I would, honestly say that mental recovery is almost a little bit more important. You just, if the physical recovery is something that you have to do, then yes, you have to do that first, but then you get to do the big work. Yeah,
exactly. But that's all I've got.
That was amazing.
That was a big one. But honestly, I found, like I said, the topic
super
really interesting.
Yeah.
And I'm hoping that it can give anyone listening some insight into why our brains do what they do when we do restrict food intake. And it's not bloody natural. So your body hearts so damn hard and it's so resilient. But
totally,
give it what it needs to be its most healthy self, Any final thoughts, even though that this two-parter is longer than like a Lord of the Rings movie?
No, I think we've said it all.
Yeah.
I don't think I shied away from my commentary throughout it, so I won't give you any more thoughts.
Fair enough. Well, that's all for today's podcast. Thank you so much for joining us. You can find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Amazon Music, or wherever you get your podcasts. And don't forget to subscribe to make sure you don't miss an episode. And please leave us a little review or a rating. that helps out a lot. And we want to see your comments. You can follow us on Instagram at pavedwithgoldpod, send us a Gmail at pavedwithgoldpod@gmail.com, visit our website pavedwithgoldpodcast.com. All of those links will be in the show notes along with extra resources. And until next time, stay safe and we'll talk to you soon.
Goodbye. Bye.
This podcast is general in nature and has not taken your personal circumstances or medical history into account. We are here to share our own experiences and the things that we have found helpful throughout our own personal recovery journeys. Please remember that each person's journey and circumstances are different, and not all of the information contained in this podcast may be relatable to you. It's important you consult your own GP or recovery team to seek out tailored advice before making any important decisions relating to your own health and recovery process. If you have found any of the content in this episode distressing, please contact your care team or a medical professional. If you or someone you know is in crisis and needs help now, please contact emergency services in your region immediately.